Fransha, you were part of a group of more than 200 scientists that compiled the latest IPCC report. What would you say were the main findings of the report?
Yes, Annette, that was a wonderful process to be part of. 254 scientists, 64 countries.
Sure.
And it was a period of 3 years that it took to complete this latest assessment of the state of global warming and the state of climate change. So the main findings of this report is, in the first place, something I've mentioned already. The most recent and the best estimate we have available now for global warming is that 1.1 degree Celsius value I've already mentioned.
Yeah.
But then the report, of course, found that we are now extremely close to exceeding these critical thresholds of global warming, namely 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. And the report, in fact, made the quite startling and alarming finding that it is now more likely than not that we are going to exceed that 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold of global warming. Even in the presence of our very best mitigation effort, we are now heading towards exceeding that threshold. And that's the next important finding, that may well happen in the early 2030s. So we are basically now a decade away from exceeding this critically important threshold. In a best effort climate change mitigation effort, and maybe later on I can explain what that will mean in terms of reducing carbon dioxide emissions, we still remain likely to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. So that threshold we can likely still avoid in the presence of very strong mitigation. And from that basis, the report then continued, of course, to outline a series of important changes that we can expect in the climate system. Now, of course, that's very wide-ranging, that set of findings, because it really covers weather systems that affect every part of the globe.
Yeah.
But what I can maybe just mention generally is that, of course, in the presence of higher surface temperature, we can expect that a variety of extreme events will start to occur more frequently. And that starts with tropical cyclones. We are, of course, seeing the first fingerprints of this change already across the planet. In our own region, the best example is tropical cyclone Idai. We've never had such an intense tropical cyclone in the Mozambique Channel before. And as many viewers will know, it killed in the end about 1,300 people.
Sure.
It is the biggest weather disaster in terms of a flood event in the recorded history in Africa south of the equator. So that was a clearly unprecedented cyclonic storm. But even more important for our region is the projected increase in heat waves that the report is very clear about. So of course, as soon as we increase the average temperature, the long-lasting heat waves also start to occur more frequently. And then finally, for some parts of the world, and it includes our region unfortunately, more frequent drought. So general increases in what we call hot extremes in the report, general increases in heavy precipitation events, and general increases in increased storm systems, of which the tropical cyclones are of course the most important.
Sure. That does sound a little bit scary, and you've just answered my next question of how evident are the effects of climate change in South Africa.
I'll just add one more point to your question on Southern African climate change.
You can, definitely.
So the important thing we should realize in terms of our region is that it is a region that is already naturally warm and dry. And all South Africans know about drought. Our region is frequently affected by drought, roughly every 2 to 7 years, because it tends to follow the El Niño-La Niña cycle. But in a changing climate, this region is projected to become drastically warmer. The important fact is that the region, the Southern African interior, is warming at about twice the global rate of temperature increase. So the global temperature has thus far increased by 1.1 degrees Celsius. But here where we are sitting today, the increase in temperature is already more than 2 degrees Celsius.
Sure.
So that pattern continues into the future. And of course, with that increase in the average temperature comes more frequent days with a high fire danger and more frequent heat waves in the southern African region. But then at the same time, the region is projected to become generally drier. Okay. So although the eastern part of the country, the eastern escarpment, the Drakensberg, and then northwards into Mozambique, is likely to experience more frequent intense thunderstorms, and for the case of Mozambique at least, more frequent intense landfalling tropical cyclones. For the rest of the region, it's much more about drought. The big problem is that when a region that is naturally warm and dry becomes drastically warmer and drier, there's very little that you can do about it. There are very few options in terms of adapting to such a change, specifically for agriculture and specifically for managing the water of our big dams. And that is why our region is in fact regarded by the IPCC as a climate change hotspot. That was a finding in a report on vulnerability in the near future that was issued back in 2018.
Sure. Thanks, Prof. I appreciate that answer. It does make it feel more home, that it's something that touches home and that it's actually close to us. It's not just this big thing that only touches the United States or China or the Arctic poles. It's actually something that touches home. My last question is, how important is communicating climate change?
So it's absolutely and fundamentally important. And of course, that's why I was very keen to accept your invitation today. And thank you again for that. Let me start by the report that was issued earlier this week, the 6th assessment report of the IPCC, specifically the Working Group 1 component. That report is going straight to the upcoming 26th Conference of the Parties, which is the next big United Nations climate change negotiations meeting in November. Hopefully it will strongly influence the negotiations. And the IPCC reports do have a history of influencing the negotiations. That is really, of course, what determine the action humanity is to take in terms of trying to mitigate climate change. So this communication process must occur more broadly, of course. It's important that, for a start, policymakers in South Africa know to the largest extent possible about the risks that climate change poses to South Africa, starting with impacts on our economy. But of course, it's also about vulnerable communities in South Africa. Just think, for example, of all the people that live in South Africa in informal housing, how vulnerable they are to heat wave events. We can just think what happened in Mozambique when tropical cyclone Idai made landfall. So the fact that risk is increasing must be communicated to a city like Beira, for example.
Yeah.
All sectors need to plan. Agriculture in South Africa needs to plan for more frequent droughts, more frequent heat waves. And of course, the general public needs to know about this, because in their own lives they can make some changes in terms of being less carbon intensive in terms of their lifestyles. But of course, they also need to hopefully they also need to be aware of the fact, so that they can hopefully apply some pressure on the South African government to also walk this path of strong climate change mitigation. So communication is all important, and of course I myself as a scientist has the responsibility to do what I can to get the message out there, and today, for example, was an important opportunity that will help with that, I'm sure.
I agree with you, Prof, and I really appreciate you taking the time to chat to us here at Vox Weather. I hope you guys understand a little bit better what is climate change and that it actually impacts you as a South African here home. Thank you very much for your time, Prof.
My great pleasure. Thank you, Annette. Thank you.